handcuffed in broad daylight, laughed at inside a police station, all because they refused to believe who he was. But what the officers didn't know was that the man they humiliated wasn't a criminal at all. He was one of the most powerful lawyers in the city. And when the truth came out, the entire department was left in shock. It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning. Anthony Williams, a sharp, confident black lawyer known for his calm demeanor and relentless pursuit of justice, had just finished breakfast and was heading to his office, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, briefcase in hand, and his lawyer's ID tucked neatly inside. Anthony looked every inch the professional he was. But to the group of police officers patrolling the area, none of that seemed to matter. As Anthony stepped out of his car near a convenience store, he noticed officers eyeing him with suspicion. One officer approached, hand already resting on his holster. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" the officer barked. Anthony turned, polite but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "There have been reports of suspicious activity. You fit the description. Hands where I can see them." Anthony's eyebrows furrowed. Fit the description? He was carrying nothing but a briefcase and wearing a tie. Still, before he could fully respond, the officers surrounded him. A small crowd began to form, watching as this successful black man was treated like a criminal for simply existing. When Anthony tried to explain, the lead officer cut him off. "Save it. We'll figure out the truth at the station." And just like that, in front of stunned onlookers, Anthony Williams, one of the city's top defense lawyers, was wrongfully arrested. The ride to the precinct was suffocating. Anthony sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists digging into the metal cuffs, his briefcase shoved carelessly on the floor by the officer in the passenger seat. He kept his head high, his silence deliberate. He knew better than to argue in this moment. His words would fall on deaf ears. The officer spoke as though he weren't even there. "Another one of these guys thinking he's too good to follow the rules." One muttered, "Yeah, suit and tie won't hide what's really going on." The other sneered. Their assumptions were clear. To them, he wasn't a professional. He wasn't a man with years of legal victories. He was just a suspect. When they arrived, Anthony was led into the precinct in full view of everyone inside. Heads turned. Some looked surprised at the sight of a man in a perfectly pressed navy suit being marched in like a criminal, while others smirked knowingly, as if it confirmed their biases. At the booking desk, the officer shoved Anthony forward, picked him up outside a store, acting suspicious, probably casing the place. Anthony turned calmly, his voice steady. "Suspicious? For stepping out of my car in a suit and carrying a briefcase." The officer rolled his eyes. "You can drop the attitude. People like you always got an excuse." The words stung the air. "People like you." Everyone in the room heard it, and the implication was impossible to ignore. They emptied his pockets, removed his watch, and took his wallet. When they found his ID, the officer glanced at it, but scoffed. "Anthony Williams." "Huh? Lawyer, it says." "Cute. You faked this yourself." Laughter erupted from a couple of younger officers nearby. Anthony inhaled deeply, resisting the urge to lash out. His dignity was his weapon, and he would not let them strip that away. They put him in a holding cell, still in his tailored suit, still handcuffed, while others in casual clothes eyed him curiously. Whispers floated through the station. "That guy doesn't look like the usual crowd. Who is he?" Anthony sat on the bench, his back straight, his eyes fixed forward. He thought of his clients, the people he had defended against unfair treatment, against biased officers and unjust systems. Now here he was, experiencing the very same humiliation he had fought to protect others from. Hours passed. No charges, no evidence, just arrogance holding him in place. Finally, when a detective walked in and caught sight of Anthony, everything shifted. The detective froze, staring in disbelief before muttering, "Wait a second, that's Anthony Williams. He's one of the best defense attorneys in this city. What is he doing in holding?" The room went silent. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. The ones who arrested him stiffened, their confidence faltering. They hadn't just arrested a man. They had arrested the wrong man, and the humiliation they thought they were inflicting on him was about to boomerang right back. The station had gone uncomfortably quiet. The detective's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "That man is Anthony Williams. He's a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. He's one of the top defense attorneys in the state. How in the world is he sitting in our holding cell?" The room shifted uneasily. The younger officers looked away, pretending to shuffle papers. The booking officer coughed, suddenly fascinated with the computer screen. But the two who had arrested Anthony stood frozen, faces pale, confidence draining from them like air from a balloon. Anthony remained seated on the bench inside the cell, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to say a word. The silence itself was his weapon now. The detective turned sharply to the arresting officers. What exactly did he do? The lead officer stammered. He fit the description. Suspicious behavior near the store. The detective's eyebrows shot up. Suspicious? The man was in a tailored suit, carrying a briefcase. That's your suspicious behavior. His voice dripped with disbelief. One of the officers tried to defend himself. "He gave us attitude, didn't cooperate." Anthony finally rose to his feet, stepping forward to the bars. His voice was calm but powerful, commanding the room. "I didn't give you attitude. I gave you the truth. I told you I was an attorney. I told you I had nothing to hide. You refused to listen. You saw my skin, not my credentials. You saw a stereotype, not a man." The cell block fell silent. Every word struck like a hammer. The detective clenched his jaw, furious. "Unlock this cell. Now." Keys rattled, the lock clicked, and the door swung open. Anthony stepped out, smoothing his suit jacket, reclaiming the dignity they had tried to strip from him. He reached for his briefcase, which an officer had tossed carelessly on the desk. He picked it up with deliberate calm, brushing off the dust as if brushing off their arrogance. The detective turned to him, his tone respectful. "Mr. Williams, I am deeply sorry for this. This should never have happened." Anthony's gaze didn't soften. "You're right. It should never have happened, but it did. And not because of a mistake, but because of a mindset. Your officers weren't protecting the public. They were profiling me. And today they got caught." The officers shifted uncomfortably, shame creeping into their faces. Phones in the lobby had already captured footage of Anthony being led into the station in cuffs. Now more recordings were being made as he stood tall, confronting the very system that tried to humiliate him. Anthony continued, his voice measured but strong. "If I weren't a lawyer, if I didn't have status, what would have happened? How many other men have sat in this same cell with no way to prove their worth, treated like criminals simply for existing?" The crowd of detainees murmured in agreement. A couple of them even clapped softly. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it could not be silenced. The detective looked furious at his own officers. "You've disgraced this department. There will be consequences." Anthony straightened his tie, looked each officer in the eye, and said one final line before walking out. "Next time you put a man in handcuffs, make sure you're not the criminal in the story." The station buzzed with whispers as Anthony strode out, free at last, his dignity intact, his truth undeniable. But outside those walls, the storm was just beginning. The precinct was silent as Anthony stepped out of the holding cell, his shoes clicking against the tile with a sharpness that seemed to cut through the tension in the air. He adjusted his tie, lifted his briefcase from the desk where it had been tossed, and walked past the officers with a dignity they could no longer deny him. The detective who had recognized him trailed close behind, apologizing quietly, but Anthony's silence said more than any words could. Everyone in the room knew the officers had humiliated not just a man but a respected lawyer, and now their mistake was about to haunt them. The moment Anthony walked out of the station into the sunlight, cameras and phones captured him. The same bystanders who had filmed his arrest were waiting, their phones raised, recording every step of his release. He didn't wave or speak. He didn't need to. The sight of a dignified black lawyer emerging from wrongful arrest was powerful enough. Within minutes, the videos hit the internet, flooding social media platforms with the shocking story. Clips of Anthony in cuffs, being pushed against his car, and later standing inside the cell spread like wildfire. Twitter trended with hashtags like #JusticeForAnthony and #WrongfullyArrested. TikTok creators reposted the footage with captions like, "This is what profiling looks like," and "If this can happen to a lawyer, imagine everyone else." Overnight, the city couldn't stop talking. By morning, national news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters showed side-by-side images. Anthony commanding a courtroom in one photo, and Anthony being shoved into a squad car in another. The contrast outraged viewers everywhere. News anchors spoke with grim voices. How could such a respected lawyer be treated as a criminal without cause? Inside the police department, panic spread. The chief of police held a press conference, his face tense as he promised an internal investigation. "This department does not condone racial profiling. We are reviewing the officer's actions immediately." But his words rang hollow. The public wanted accountability, not excuses. Journalists hammered him with questions. Would this have happened if Mr. Williams were white? How many others have been profiled without evidence? The chief struggled for answers. Anthony, meanwhile, kept his composure. He didn't rush to give interviews. He didn't fuel the outrage with fiery speeches. Instead, he returned quietly to his work, walking into courtrooms, defending clients, and letting his actions speak for him. But the public noticed. His calmness, his refusal to lash out, made him appear stronger than ever. Clients began to seek him out not only for his legal skills, but because they trusted him as someone who truly understood the struggle for dignity. But Anthony knew silence couldn't last forever. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person treated unjustly, every man or woman who had been locked in a cell without the power to fight back. So when invitations arrived from universities, civil rights groups, and even national talk shows, Anthony hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. He realized his story wasn't his alone. It was a mirror reflecting the experiences of thousands. His first speech came at a local university. Standing in front of law students, he told them plainly, "Your degree won't protect you from prejudice, but it gives you the tools to fight it. Don't waste them." The room erupted in applause, and the students left with a fire burning in their eyes. Next came rallies, where thousands gathered in city squares holding signs with his name and his words. Anthony spoke about dignity, about truth, about the need for systemic change. He didn't call out the officers by name, didn't make it personal. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture. "This is not about two men," he told the crowd. "It's about a mindset, a system. Until we address that, this will keep happening." His restraint, his refusal to turn the story into revenge, only made him more respected. The officers who arrested him faced disciplinary hearings. Their names were dragged across headlines, their arrogance reduced to evidence of what profiling looks like in uniform. The department scrambled to contain the damage, suspending them and promising reforms. For the first time, the police were not in control of the story. The people were. Anthony's phrase, "Make sure you're not the criminal in the story," became a rallying cry. Protesters painted it on banners. Social media users turned it into memes. Activists quoted it at marches. What began as a moment of humiliation inside a police station had transformed into a movement that even Anthony hadn't foreseen. And yet, Anthony remained grounded. He still rose early, still reviewed case files, still appeared in court with his usual calm. He reminded himself daily that fame was fleeting, but truth was lasting. If his story could spark reform, then his pain had meaning. Months later, Anthony was invited to speak on the courthouse steps, the very place where he had once been stopped and cuffed. Cameras crowded the scene, the air electric with anticipation. He stood tall, his voice steady as he declared, "They didn't arrest me for a crime. They arrested me for who I am. But dignity is not theirs to take, and respect is not theirs to decide. Justice is bigger than prejudice, and truth always rises." The crowd roared with applause. Some chanted his name. Others cried, quietly moved by his calm defiance. Across the nation, the clip spread once again, cementing Anthony not just as a lawyer but as a symbol of resilience. Police reforms began in small ways: mandatory bias training, stricter protocols on stops and arrests, body cameras more widely enforced. Anthony didn't fool himself into thinking the problem was solved, but he knew seeds had been planted. The system had been forced to look in the mirror. Late one evening, Anthony returned alone to the courthouse steps. The marble glowed under streetlights, silent and steady. He thought back to the day he had been humiliated, the laughter of officers, the sting of cold handcuffs around his wrists. And then he thought of what had grown from it: the speeches, the chants, the reforms, the young people who now walked taller because of his words. He smiled faintly, adjusting his tie. The system had tried to strip him of dignity, but instead it had amplified his voice. He walked up the steps, his briefcase swinging at his side, no longer as just a lawyer, but as a man who had turned humiliation into history, a man whose story would remind the world that truth always outlives arrogance, and that no matter how heavy the cuffs, dignity can never be chained. The weeks following Anthony's speech became a blur of noise, headlines, and pressure, but through it all, he kept his steps measured and his voice steady. The city could not stop talking about what had happened. Every news outlet carried the story. Every social media feed was full of clips from the courthouse steps. Every discussion in cafes, classrooms, and offices seemed to circle back to the same question: how could this happen, and what would change because of it? Anthony, though, was not distracted by the noise. He carried on his work, returning to his cases, defending clients, standing in court with the same unshakable calm. But beneath that composure was a fire burning brighter than it ever had before. He knew that moments like this did not come often, and if he let the outrage fade into silence, then the humiliation he endured would have been for nothing. He was determined that his story would not end as a headline or a viral video. It had to become something bigger, something lasting. Invitations began pouring in. Universities wanted him to speak to law students. Civil rights groups asked him to share his story at rallies. Talk shows sent him requests to appear on national television. At first, Anthony declined. He wasn't interested in fame. But when he thought about the countless men and women without his education, without his title, without his shield of privilege, he realized he had been given a platform not for himself, but for them. Slowly, he began to accept. He stood at podiums and lecture halls, speaking to young law students about the responsibility they carried. "Your degree won't protect you from prejudice," he told them, "but it will give you a voice to fight it. Use it." He stood at rallies in city squares, raising his voice against systemic bias, his words echoing over crowds that chanted his name, not because he sought to be a hero, but because he had become a symbol of quiet strength in the face of arrogance. The officers who had arrested him remained suspended, their hearings dragged out in front of the public, their reputations reduced to cautionary tales. But Anthony never once mentioned their names in his speeches. When asked by reporters if he sought revenge, he only shook his head. It was never about those two men alone. It's about the mindset that allowed them to see me as suspicious while dressed in a suit with a briefcase. If I spend my time tearing down individuals, I lose sight of the system that must be reformed. His restraint, his refusal to turn personal pain into personal vendetta, only elevated his stature further. People saw him as more than a lawyer now. He had become a leader. In courtrooms, judges began looking at him differently. Some offered nods of respect. Others carried a quiet shame in their eyes, perhaps realizing that if a man of his standing could face such treatment, then their own courts were not as blind to bias as they claimed. Clients flocked to him, not just because of his reputation for winning cases, but because they felt he understood something deeper than the law. He understood the fight for dignity. And for Anthony, each new client became another chance to turn his humiliation into a weapon against injustice. Months passed, but the story did not fade. Books were written, documentaries were pitched, activists quoted his line, "Make sure you're not the criminal in the story," as a rallying cry. Anthony sometimes marveled at how a few careless words from arrogant officers had sparked a national conversation. But he also carried the weight of knowing that conversation could easily lose momentum without constant fuel. So he kept speaking, kept writing, kept standing. But one evening, as he sat alone in his office, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs, Anthony reflected on what the experience had taught him. He thought about the moment his wrists were bound by cold metal, the laughter of the officers ringing in his ears, the humiliation of being paraded into a station as though he were guilty of some crime. That pain had cut deep, but it had also revealed something to him. That dignity is not a gift granted by authority, but a truth carried within oneself. The cuffs had bruised his skin, but they had not bruised his spirit. And that was the lesson he wanted to pass on. The chance came sooner than expected. A local community center invited him to speak to a group of young men who had all faced profiling, arrests, and harassment. They weren't lawyers, they weren't judges, they didn't have degrees or prestige. Many of them were tired, disillusioned, beaten down by a system that seemed determined to crush them. As Anthony stood in front of them, he saw his younger self reflected back in their eyes, the same frustration, the same doubt, the same anger. He took a deep breath and began. They put me in handcuffs because of my skin, because of my presence, because they couldn't imagine a man like me being anything but a suspect. They tried to take my dignity, but dignity is something no one can take from you. The world will tell you that you don't belong, that you're suspicious, that you fit the description. But I am here to tell you this. You are more than their labels. You are more than their prejudice. And if you stand tall, if you carry yourself with truth, then no humiliation can define you. Only you can define yourself. The room was silent at first, but then one by one, heads began to nod. Eyes filled with tears. The young men who had walked in slouched and broken now sat taller, a little more certain, a little more determined. And Anthony realized in that moment that his wrongful arrest had not been a curse, it had been a calling. By the end of the year, Anthony's name had become synonymous with resilience. Schools taught his story as an example of prejudice confronted and dignity defended. Police departments across the country began adopting reforms, citing his case as the spark. He never pretended that racism had been defeated, never claimed victory in a battle still raging, but he did know this. Change had begun, and he had been part of it. Late one night, walking past the courthouse steps where so much had begun, Anthony paused. The marble glowed in the street lights, silent and unmoving. He thought about the first time those steps had nearly broken him, the humiliation of being stopped, cuffed, and dragged into custody like a criminal. And then he thought about what had grown from that pain. The speeches, the movements, the reforms, the young men now standing taller because of his words. He exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. The system had tried to reduce him to nothing more than a suspect, but instead, it had made him into something greater. A lawyer, yes, but also a voice. A lesson, a reminder to the world that justice cannot be bound, truth cannot be silenced, and dignity cannot be denied. And with that, Anthony walked up those courthouse steps, not as a man defined by the cuffs once locked around his wrists, but as a man who had turned humiliation into history.